I have a tremendous amount of respect for the College Football Hall of Fame and the job that they do. I know they have to have a criteria to protect the integrity. I think of the members. But I think Mike's circumstances is probably different. I'm glad that they decided to lower the percentage. Obviously he had a huge impact on not only college football, but really the way the football is played, whether it's the NFL, high school football, whatever it may be. What he did was probably as influential as anything anybody's done in a very long time in college football. And so I was glad to see him do it. I think the one thing that stands out about Mike, I mean, you look, he had success at Texas Tech, he had success at Washington State, and he had success at Mississippi State. Those are all programs that have typically not had success. And I think that, the College Football Hall of Fame, I think, was smart to recognize that, some programs historically have had a tremendous amount of success, and winning 60% of your games at those institutions is different than winning 60% of your games at Ohio State or Oklahoma or someplace that has, this great history and this great tradition and is designed to and built to win football games. And so, I think I think you have to consider that when you look at someone's winning percentage and the schools that they've been at. And he's had places, again, he had success at places that are difficult historically to have success at. And so I think that should be taken into account. And obviously the impact he had on the game of football should be as well. So he's I'm hoping that he'll get in. I think he'll be a very, Mike is certainly somebody that should be recognized, and his career was outstanding. And again, the impact he had on the game is hard to measure. Mike is an original. I mean, he's very, very unique. The way he approached the game was different. I think courageous in some ways. He was very true to himself. He had a standard that he expected, players, coaches, everybody in the program to meet. He was very demanding. I think that's one thing that people probably don't realize about Mike is how demanding he was of a coach. I mean, he had very high expectations for people. I think one of the things that was so unique about Mike is he didn't really care, where you came from, what your background was. If he believed you could help the program win, whether you were a young coach with very little pedigree, or you were a player that came from, a 0-star recruit, or a guy that came from a junior college or some obscure program, he didn't care. He could find a way to utilize you. He could find the talents in everybody. Everybody's got a different set of talents and unique character traits that allow them to be successful. And Mike just brought out the best of that in people. I mean, he really could find, niches for guys to succeed in. And I think that's why he developed so many coaches. You look at his coaching tree, it's pretty remarkable, the number of successful coaches that he developed. And, and the big reason why is he gave guys responsibility. He listened to them. He wasn't afraid to give a young coach a ton of responsibility and let him go out there and earn his keep. And I think it all helped us grow as coaches. I was fortunate to be Mike's GA all the way back in 1997 at the University of Kentucky when Hal Mumme was the head coach. And I got a lot of responsibility, probably more than I should have, but it helped me grow as a coach. And Mike was the very best at finding ways for guys to help the program. I think the big thing Mike was authentic. He was himself. And I think everybody bought into that. I mean, I think he had a different background. He didn't play college football. He, went to law school. He probably had a different road to becoming a head coach than a lot of other people did. He started at really, really small schools, worked his way up. But he was an outside the box thinker. And to me, that was what I took from that as much as anything else was like, you have to be who you are. You have to recognize, your strengths and your weaknesses, and you have to identify people that can fill in the blanks. And I think he did that really well. I think he knew who he was. I think he knew what his strengths were. I think he knew what his weaknesses were, and I think he was able to go out and find people that could help build his program and as I said, fill in where they needed to. I think that's the biggest takeaway for me. He was way ahead of the game. we practiced like an NFL team back in the late 90s, and everybody was grinding on each other and beating on each other and having 3.5 hour practices and all the things. And we took care of our players. We had short practices. Obviously the scheme was unique and different, and kind of ahead of the time as well. And extreme in some ways. But I think that's what led him to have that kind of success that he did at difficult programs was, if you were at Washington State and you lined up in the I formation and you tried to run the ball down people's throats, you're going to have a difficult time doing that. And he had to find different ways to win at different places and that weren't necessarily easy to win at. I think if you look at the air raid, you say, wow, there's a lot of stuff going on, a lot of plays, very complex, probably complicated. And although it appears that way, it's just the opposite. It's a very simple offense, based on fundamentals. Mike was a great teacher of fundamentals, a great believer in fundamentals. One of the things that he and Hal Mumme did, I think, that made the whole thing work was they took the really important aspects of the plays. In other words, if you're running mesh, you needed to be able to settle in zones after you meshed, and then you need to be able to turn and go straight upfield. So those guys would take these things that you needed to do well, and they would create drills, and we would drill them all the time. And so our players were very well versed. We had very few plays. The guys could execute at a very, very high level. And so I think in a lot of ways, the offense was exactly the opposite of the way many people perceive it to be. As I said, we would play people that would talk about all the different formations that we ran and all the different things we did. For example, one guy being off the ball, one receiver being off, another being on. And we just let those guys line up where they wanted to and have freedom to do that. And it created all kinds of issues for people trying to break our plays down and our schemes and our formations and all the things, because it looked like a lot, and it really wasn't. It was just, empowering some of the players, let those guys make decisions. And again, that was probably Mike's biggest strength was, giving the quarterback an ability to check plays, get us in the run plays, get us out of bad plays. He allowed, the players to have a lot of freedom within the offense, but at the same time, they had to be very disciplined in their approach, the way they practiced. And there were some fundamental things that they had to be really good at, or they weren't going to be able to play. As I said earlier, man, he was just incredibly unique. He didn't really care about what other people thought. He wasn't afraid to try something new. I remember one year we were coaching at Texas Tech, and we were recruiting some kids from Evangel Christian in Shreveport. And we went and watched those guys practice, and they were in this shotgun formation with the quarterback was like 8-9 yards deep. And so, we decided we were going to try to implement that at Texas Tech at the time and do some creative things to help in the protection of the quarterback, because we were starting to see more blitz schemes and different things to try to attack us. And he goes and sees that, and he comes back and he goes, well, let's try this. So we did it all spring. We didn't have a center that could snap. The thing we found out was Evangel started training those kids when they were in the 7th and 8th grade to be able to do that. But that was Mike. I mean, he just didn't care. He was somebody who loved the game of football, but he also had a ton of interest outside of football. I remember him saying he was going to go to New York. And we're in a staff meeting one time. And he goes, hey, I'm going to visit New York. And this was when, Donald Trump was on The Apprentice. And he goes, I'm going to call Trump. Well, Mike Leach didn't know Donald Trump. Donald Trump didn't know Mike Leach. Mike Leach calls, information, asks for Donald Trump number. They give it to him. He calls and leaves a message for Donald Trump. And 3 or 4 days later, we're in a staff meeting, and Donald Trump calls him back, and those guys kind of struck up a friendship that was very, very odd, that came from just a random phone call. And that's the kind of stuff Mike would do. I mean, like I said, he would try anything, do anything, wasn't afraid of being told no. Just was one of those guys that just kind of lived life on his terms. And that's what made him so much fun to be around.